Greetings, and welcome to this exploration of one of the most disturbing instances in American history. Please let me know where you're watching from and what time you're listening to this narration in the comments section before we start. The locations and times of day or night that these recorded accounts reach are of interest to us. It was 1889. The small community of Oakridge, which is located in upstate New York in the foothills of the Adirondack Mountains, has experienced a cold November. A copse of old oak trees divided the town from the town cemetery, Elmwood, which was situated on a sloping incline with a view of the valley. Constable Frederick Merritt made a finding here that would have a lasting impact on the area. Merritt had been called to the cemetery early on November 12th by Elijah Harmon, the groundskeeper, who had come to set up a space for a burial that day. At several gravesites, Harmon found what looked to be freshly disturbed ground, according to the official report submitted to the Oakridge Municipal Records Office. Animals occasionally dug at the softer earth. Thus, this was not unusual in and of itself. Harmon was interested in the systematic character of the disruptions, however. There were 7 burials with evidence of manipulation, all from the previous month. The earth had been removed with care, Merritt wrote, not scattered as would be expected from animal interference. The coffins below had been opened, and in each case the deceased appeared to have been rearranged. What he meant by rearranged would not be clear until much later. The constable's report, which was kept in the county archives until a courthouse fire in 1962 destroyed many of the original documents, described the scene with troubling precision. When local newspaper editor Samuel Whiteham contacted Harmon, a guy in his 60s who had been caring for the cemetery for almost 30 years, he was clearly upset. "In all my years," Harmon said, "I've never seen anything like it. The soil was replaced almost neatly, as if someone had taken great pains not to be discovered. Had it not been for the recent rain causing slight settling, I might never have noticed." The choice of burials was especially upsetting to both guys. They were all reasonably young, no older than 6 weeks, but otherwise had nothing in common. A young woman who had died of tuberculosis, a middle-aged mill worker, an old shopkeeper, and 4 other people of various ages and socioeconomic standing were among the dead. Later on, this ostensibly random pick would be crucial to comprehending the motivations of the criminals. In 1889, there were a little over 800 people living in Oakridge. With a sawmill as its commercial hub, it was essentially a logging community, but the railroad's arrival 5 years earlier had started to alter the area's character. The Blackwood brothers, Edmund and Edgar, who had bought the old Wilkinson home on the outskirts of town and moved there in the summer of 1888, were among the more recent arrivals. A 2-story farmhouse that predates even the earliest municipal records, set back from the road and encircled by a stone wall. After its previous tenant, Jeremiah Wilkinson, a reclusive Civil War veteran who had returned from the war, a changed man, died. The Wilkinson house, as it was still known today despite its ownership shift, had been vacant for almost 7 years. Locals described the home as gloomy and foreboding, and some said it had fallen into ruin during its vacancy. On their walk to and from school, kids stayed away from it because they said they heard weird noises coming from behind the deteriorating stone wall. The Blackwoods had arrived without warning. The property had never been listed for sale, and the transaction had been handled by an Albany legal firm that had no local connection. The brothers made a sizable cash payment, which sparked a lot of conjecture over their financial situation. They started renovating the house right away, insisting on doing the inside work themselves while employing local workers for the facade. The Blackwoods were private. They created the inevitable commotion that new arrivals always create in tiny towns, but when they turned out to be largely uninteresting, interest in them faded. They were tall, thin, pale-faced males in their early 30s with dark hair. They were well-dressed, but not pretentious, and they occasionally went to the Presbyterian church. They weren't friendly, but they were courteous. Their resemblance and their propensity to complete each other's sentences, a characteristic that some found endearing and others unnerving, were actually the most remarkable aspects of them. Although the twins never established a clinic in Oakridge, town records show that they had portrayed themselves as physicians, specifically as anatomy researchers. According to their claims, They studied in Philadelphia before moving north for the peaceful mountain air that was ideal for academic endeavors. The brothers appeared uninterested in making friends, according to Henry Sullivan, the village doctor, who had tried to foster professional companionship. In a later letter to a colleague in Albany, Dr. Sullivan recalled, "I invited the Blackwoods to dinner on multiple occasions, hoping to talk about new medical advancements and maybe build a professional relationship that could help our small community." The Blackwoods' responses were consistently courteous but aloof. The discussion stayed solidly on broad subjects. On the one occasion when they agreed, they only mentioned improvements in preservation methods and the mechanical characteristics of human tissues in the most general ways when I asked them about their research. I got the clear sense from their demeanor that they looked down on my country practice with thinly concealed contempt. According to the town registration, the Blackwoods made timely and complete tax payments. Mrs. Abigail Carson, their hired housekeeper, came 3 times a week to clean and prepare meals. In 1954, at the age of 76, Thomas Perkins, Mrs. Carson's grandson, spoke to the Oakridge Historical Society about his grandmother's perceptions of the home. Gran said it was the strangest place she'd ever worked, Perkins remembered. The brothers kept the cellar locked at all times. They had a separate entrance to it from outside, hidden behind a trellis covered in vines. She never went down there, and they never offered to show her. When she asked about it once, they told her it was their laboratory, and the chemicals they used were dangerous to those without proper training. Perkins recalled his grandmother's description of the house's inside as sterile and well organized. In the front parlor, the brothers kept a small library with books on ancient history, philosophy, and medicine, in addition to scientific publications. The titles Mrs. Carson noted during dusting suggested that they were especially interested in Greek and Egyptian burial customs. The only truly personal items in the house, Perkins went on, were a collection of daguerreotypes and the study portraits of a woman who Gran thought might be their mother, though they never spoke of family. And there was a music box that one of them, Edmund, she thought, would sometimes wind in the evenings. It played a tune she didn't recognize, something melancholy that made her uncomfortable, though she couldn't say why. Mrs. Carson also mentioned the peculiar fragrance that occasionally filled the house, a harsh, medicinal chemical stench that caused her eyes to moisten. According to the brothers, they employed it as a preservative while conducting their research. Large wooden crates were often delivered to them, she said, and they were always carried straight to the cellar entrance. The delivery men were outsiders who came and went without mingling with the locals. They were never locals. Mrs. Carson described the brothers' tendency of going for long walks at odd hours as the most strange feature of the household. After midnight, they would depart wearing black clothing and carrying lanterns with the shutters almost closed so that only the smallest amount of light might escape. They would return before daybreak, sometimes with muddy boots and other times with what seemed like large satchels. Once, while washing clothes, Mrs. Carson discovered strange stains, dark smudges that were difficult to remove with soap and needed a lot of scrubbing. She brought this up to Edgar, who immediately seized the things from her, claiming they needed special handling because they had been tainted by chemical compounds from their job. He asked her not to handle any such stained objects in the future, but he offered her extra money for her trouble. The Blackwood twins were not immediately suspected after the finding at Elmwood Cemetery. In fact, because he believed that outsiders would be more inclined to conduct such a heinous act, Constable Merritt's initial investigation concentrated on temporary laborers from the lumber camps. The priest, the cemetery groundskeeper, and the family members of the deceased whose graves had been disturbed were all questioned by the policeman. Other than the fact that all of the impacted burials were quite recent, no pattern was found. The Presbyterian Church's Reverend James Hawthorne voiced special worry about the desecration's potential spiritual repercussions. His Sunday sermon, after the discovery, described forces of darkness working against the peace of our departed brethren. Church records show a rise in requests for more prayers and blessings for recently buried family members, a reflection of the community's anxiety that their loved ones could become the next victims. Needless to say, the news upset the town. In its November 14th edition, the Oakridge Gazette said that the neighborhood was gripped by a quiet terror. The town council authorized funding for more night patrols outside the cemetery. Parents kept their children closer to home, and church attendance rose. These volunteer-led patrols, equipped with shotguns and lamps, kept watch for a number of nights. They did not report any odd behavior, despite their presence. This made some people think that the criminal might be one of them, someone who knows the routes and patrol timetables. With accusations and rebuttals threatening to erode the community's togetherness in the face of the unidentified threat, the suggestion caused friction among the volunteers. Nothing else occurred for 2 weeks. Then, another burial was disturbed on Thanksgiving night, November 28. This one belonged to 20-year-old Catherine Holloway, who had passed away 3 days prior during childbirth. She had been buried with her infant son, who had also perished with her. The constable's additional report said that their grave had been surgically opened. The baby was completely gone, yet the mother's body was undamaged. A large amount of the timberland that fed the local mill was owned by Catherine's husband, Jonathan Holloway, who was well known in Oakridge society. He had been deeply saddened by the death of his wife and child. The grave robbery added to his stress, causing him to have what his peers called a nervous collapse. Dr. Sullivan brought him to bed and gave him laudanum to help him fall asleep. The investigation's focus was altered by this development. In some ways, grave robbery was understandable, even though it was a heinous act. The removal of a child's remains raised the possibility of something more sinister and incomprehensible. Anger crystallized from the town's fear. Old beliefs reappeared and rumors proliferated. A few elderly inhabitants recounted tales of European body snatchers who provided cadavers for research to medical school's resurrection men, as they were known. Others whispered of darker practices, ancient beliefs in the mystical qualities of newborn tissues, or occult rites that required certain human remains, or experiments that went outside natural law. Speculation arose since none of these explanations seemed to adequately explain what was occurring in Oakridge. At this point, the Blackwoods housekeeper, Mrs. Carson, came to Constable Merritt to voice her worries. "I noticed that the chemical smell in the house had been especially strong on the morning after Thanksgiving," she stated. Every time she walked into a room, the brothers' hushed voices grew silent, and they appeared anxious. Additionally, she discovered a tiny button that she knew originated from Catherine Holloway's funeral gown when sweeping close to the cellar door. She had witnessed the preparation of the body, as the town's women were expected to help with such tasks, and recalled the characteristic pearl buttons that had been used to embellish the deceased's last outfit. At first, the constable was dubious because pearl buttons were plentiful and the button could have come from any place. However, when paired with the other circumstances, the brothers' enigmatic nighttime strolls, their secluded cellar, and their anatomical research, it was sufficient to justify additional investigation. The constable handled the matter cautiously, according to his journal, which was found in his granddaughter's attic in 1957. "I have no direct evidence linking the Blackwood brothers to the cemetery desecrations," he stated. "Yet I cannot ignore the accumulation of suspicious circumstances. I shall call upon them tomorrow, ostensibly to inform them, as I have informed other prominent citizens, of our increased vigilance regarding the cemetery incidents." The paper continues, "I must proceed with the utmost care. The Blackwoods are educated men of apparent means, not the usual miscreants who pass through my jail. If they are indeed responsible for these violations, they have acted with calculation and intelligence. I cannot afford to alert them to my suspicions without substantial evidence, yet the thought that they might continue their ghoulish activities while I gather such evidence is intolerable." Merritt spoke with Judge William Harding, outlining his worries and admitting that his evidence was weak. The judge agreed that an investigation was necessary, but prudence was urged. In order to avoid giving the impression that Merritt was deliberately targeting the Blackwoods, he recommended that he first interview other recent arrivals to the community. Constable Merritt paid a visit to the Blackwood house on the 30th of November, 1889. Edmund, or maybe Edgar, had admitted him. He could never tell them apart, the constable observed. According to Merritt's log, the interview was cordial, yet tense. The brothers gave clichés regarding the deterioration of moral character in contemporary times, while expressing their understandable outrage at the cemetery crimes. The policeman was asked to search their house if he had any suspicions, which Merritt took as a sign of either extreme confidence or deliberate deception. "I declined their offer," said Merritt, stating that I had no warrant nor cause to search the premises of respected citizens. Yet as I spoke, I observed Edgar glance repeatedly toward the parlor fireplace, where a fire burned despite the mildness of the day. On the mantel sat a small glass jar, which appeared to contain a pale object suspended in liquid. When he noticed my attention upon it, he casually moved to stand in front of it, blocking my view. The constable's diary records his assessment of the property. The interior is immaculate to a degree that suggests obsession rather than mere cleanliness. The furnishings are of good quality but sparse, giving the impression of a stage set rather than a home. There are few personal effects visible, no photographs, mementos, or decorative items that might reveal something of the occupant's character or history. The overall effect is one of temporary residence, as if the brothers do not expect to remain long in Oakridge. As a matter of habit, Merritt said before he left, he had been interviewing newcomers to town. He asked the brothers where they had lived before, and why they had chosen Oakridge in particular. Their responses were evasive, but believable. They had studied in Philadelphia, but wanted a more sedate setting for their studies. A real estate circular had told them about the property. They valued the Adirondack region's isolation and scenic splendor. The constable decided to keep a closer eye on the Blackwoods, but left without incident. To create a covert surveillance system for the house, he recruited 2 dependable deputies. Nothing out of the ordinary happened for 3 nights. At around 1:30 a.m., on the 4th night, December 4th, the brothers came out with a folded canvas tarp and their almost closed lights. The deputies trailed behind them. Instead of going to the cemetery as planned, the Blackwoods walked to the train station, where they seemed to be meeting someone. For a moment, a freight train had halted to take in water. A man came down from one of the cars and gave the brothers a tiny wooden package. Money was exchanged. After that, the brothers brought their enigmatic acquisition back to their house. The transaction had taken place in near darkness, with only the dim glow of a lantern illuminating the situation, making precise observation difficult. Deputy Samuel Wilson later described the man from the train as tall and gaunt, foreign-looking, with a beard cut in an unusual fashion. Instead of detaining the stranger for interrogation, the deputies chose to continue monitoring the Blackwoods. The train and its enigmatic occupant had long since left by the time they arrived back at the station the next morning. The investigation became muddled by this development. What was the purpose of this midnight transaction if the Blackwoods were the tomb robbers? More direct action was required, Constable Merritt said. Based on the evidence so far, he was granted a warrant by Judge William Harding on December 5. At first, the judge was hesitant because she was worried about the possible consequences of wrongly accusing experts with education. "These men have connections beyond our small town," he warned Merritt. He was sufficiently concerned by the circumstantial evidence to issue the warrant, with the condition that the search be carried out in a discreet manner and with the least amount of disturbance. If we are wrong, the embarrassment to Oakridge could be considerable. Constable Merritt, his deputies, and Dr. Sullivan, who was sent in for his medical knowledge, arrived at the Blackwood home early on the morning of December 6. Merritt said the brothers welcomed the party with a curious lack of surprise, as if they had been expecting us. Before allowing the party entry into their house, they carefully reviewed the warrant, noting its terms and conditions. Nothing incriminating was found on the main levels of the Blackwood residence during the subsequent search. The brothers were chilly but cooperative. In response to inquiries regarding the cellar, they supplied a key with relative ease, but clarified that their research materials were sensitive and valuable. In order to reduce the possibility of damage, they asked that only the constable himself enter. Merritt nodded and followed them into the shadows underneath a small stone staircase. However, official records would never completely chronicle what the policeman discovered in that cellar. However, his granddaughter recalled a thorough account in his personal notebook as being written in a shaking hand, which contrasts with his typically exact handwriting. With tables, glass containers, chemicals, and medical equipment, the cellar had been transformed into a kind of laboratory. This was in line with the brothers' professed line of work. Their research's nature was what was out of alignment. The cellar walls were lined with shelves, said Merritt, upon which stood dozens of glass jars of varying sizes. Each contained a human organ or body part suspended in a clear solution that the brothers identified as a formaldehyde compound. The specimens were meticulously labeled with dates, names, and what appeared to be measurements or observations. Merritt's diary entry continues. I recognized some of the names on the labels. They corresponded to the deceased whose graves had been violated. When I pointed this out, Edgar, or perhaps Edmund, replied with unsettling calm that the similarity was coincidental, that they used a nomenclature system based on classical references for cataloging their specimens. The explanation was delivered with such confidence that, for a moment, I doubted my own certainty. During the inspection, the constable took notice of the brothers' behavior. They maintained a professional detachment that borders on the inhuman. When speaking of their specimens, clearly human remains, they used the clinical language of scientists discussing mineral samples. There is no acknowledgement of the sacred nature of what they have defiled, no recognition of the grief they have caused to the families of the deceased. It is this absence of normal human feeling, more than any physical evidence, that convinces me of their guilt. The Blackwoods insisted, when questioned, that all of their anatomical specimens had been lawfully acquired from research institutes and medical colleges in New York and Philadelphia. They presented documents that Merritt deemed dubious due to their conveniently comprehensive nature, even though they seemed professional. Merritt's account went on to say, in the back of the cellar, behind a Japanese folding screen, I found a long table on which lay what at first glance looked like the body of a child. But upon closer examination I saw with horror that it was not a single body at all, but a construction, an assembly of parts from various sources, stitched together with surgical precision. The brothers did not try to hide or explain this abomination, merely claiming that their research concerned the regenerative properties of young tissues, and that I, as a layman, could not be expected to understand the scientific significance of their work. The constable's account continues. The creation on the table was approximately the size of a 2-year-old child, but proportioned unnaturally. The head was clearly that of an infant. The Holloway child, I believe, though decomposition makes identification difficult. The limbs appear to have come from other sources, older children perhaps, or even small adults with stunted growth. Most disturbing are the crude mechanical apparatus attached to the chest cavity, brass tubes and glass cylinders containing liquids of various hues, connected to what appears to be a small electrical device of foreign manufacture. Merritt put the Blackwoods under arrest right away. They made no attempt to resist, preserving a spooky silence that the constable found more unsettling than any possible protest. They were brought to the town jail, a tiny building with just 2 cells that is usually used to detain inebriated or unruly guests. Merritt gave Dr. Sullivan instructions to record the contents of the laboratory as completely as possible before departing the Blackwood house. Despite being clearly frightened by what he had witnessed, the doctor accepted the assignment. The different specimens and equipment found in the cellar are described in clinical detail in his later report, which was saved from the courthouse fire because it had been stored in his personal files. He emphasized the advanced quality of specimen preservation, suggesting technical knowledge beyond contemporary standards and the sophisticated nature of the surgical instruments, far beyond what one would expect to find outside a major medical institution. Oakridge was rocked by the revelation at the Blackwood house. Outside the jail, a group of people gathered in an almost hostile mood. The constable requested assistance from the county sheriff because he was afraid of a lynching. In the meantime, the brothers sat in silence in their shared cell, speaking to one another now and then, but not saying anything for the official record. The mob outside the jail got larger and more agitated as night neared. Using Christian concepts of fairness and due process, Reverend Hawthorne tried to defuse the situation, but his efforts were ineffective. Witnesses later disagreed as to whether Jonathan Holloway was inciting violence or simply observing in numb shock after he reportedly emerged from his laudanum-induced stupor upon hearing the news of the arrests. Judge Harding ordered the town physician, Dr. Sullivan, and a forensic medicine expert from Albany to review the evidence from the cellar. Merritt's worst concerns were validated by their examination. There were indications that many of the preserved specimens had been taken from bodies after death, but before the natural decomposition process had progressed to a significant degree. Their conclusions about the assembled shape on the lab table were more unsettling. The creation, stated Dr. James Porter of Albany in his report published on the 10th of December 1889, consists of components harvested from no fewer than 7 distinct human sources. The head and torso appear to belong to the recently deceased infant son of Catherine Holloway. The limbs, however, derive from other sources, including what analysis suggests are other infants and small children. Most disturbing is the evident care and skill with which these disparate elements have been joined, the work of trained surgeons employing techniques at the very forefront of medical science. Dr. Porter's report continued. The mechanical and electrical apparatus integrated with the specimen suggests an attempt to stimulate muscular response post-mortem. The glass tubes contain solutions of varying compositions, preliminary analysis indicating the presence of compounds designed to prevent tissue degradation and possibly to conduct electrical impulses through deceased nerve pathways. The level of sophistication is remarkable and troubling, indicating research objectives that extend far beyond conventional anatomical study. A personal statement that was later removed from the official record but was still included in Dr. Porter's private correspondence was included at the end of the report. I cannot escape the impression that the Blackwoods were attempting something that transcends the boundaries of modern science, not merely the preservation or study of human remains, but their reanimation. If this is indeed their aim, they have ventured into territory not merely illegal or immoral, but profoundly dangerous to our understanding of life itself. It was unknown what this hideous construct was used for. The Blackwoods asked to see their research notes, but were denied access, and they refused to provide an explanation for their work, saying only that they would be vindicated by history. When authorities contacted a medical institute in Boston, the directors denied any connection to or knowledge of the brothers. Despite their request to speak with representatives from the institute, the Blackwoods remained calm in prison with a calmness that was almost inhuman. They asked about the condition of their belongings and property, demanded certain meals, and demanded bathing facilities. The first signs of agitation they displayed were not anger, as might be expected, but what Constable Merritt called a cold, calculating concern, as if they were mentally calculating the damage to their work rather than their legal situation after learning that their laboratory materials had been seized as evidence. The preliminary hearing in the case against Edmund and Edgar Blackwood started on the 15th of December, 1889. Many residents of the town were waiting outside in the snow to hear any new information, and the courthouse was crowded. The brothers eventually broke their silence and submit their plea, not guilty. The allegations were serious: grave robbing, destruction of human remains, and what the prosecution called acts of unspeakable depravity against the natural order. They asked to be represented by themselves, and the judge reluctantly accepted their request. What transpired was one of the most bizarre court cases in upstate New York history. The Blackwoods tried to defend their actions on the basis of science, rather than contesting the evidence discovered in their cellar. They discussed improvements in surgical methods, the constraints placed on medical advancement by traditional morality, and their conviction that, with a thorough grasp of human physiology, death itself could one day be defeated. Edgar Blackwood told the court, "We stand at the threshold of a new era," according to newspaper reports. The courtroom reportedly fell silent at these words, with the spectators too shocked or perplexed to respond with their customary murmurs and exclamations. Those who push the boundaries of knowledge have been persecuted by the ignorant throughout history. Galileo was imprisoned for suggesting that the earth moves around the sun. We are condemned for suggesting that the boundary between life and death is not as absolute as religious dogma would have you believe. Judge Harding permitted the statement, but cautioned the defendants that legal explanations for illegal behavior would not be accepted. Edmund Blackwood followed with a similar speech to the court. The human body is a machine, complex beyond our current understanding, but a machine nonetheless. When it ceases to function, conventional wisdom declares it worthless, fit only for burial and decay. We reject this wasteful approach. The components retain value, potential purpose. Our work seeks to harness this potential for the advancement of medical science and ultimately the benefit of all mankind. District Attorney George Hammond, the prosecutor, responded with open disdain. No appeal to scientific progress can justify the violation of that sacred covenant between the living and the dead. The defendants speak of machines and components, of waste and utility, but they speak of human beings, our neighbors, our family members, laid to rest in consecrated ground with the expectation of peace and dignity. Testimony from the relatives of the desecrated graves was given by the prosecution. Their stories severely harmed whatever sympathy the brothers might have wanted to engender for their cause, and their anguish and horror were evident. Mrs. Holloway had to be brought into the courtroom, still frail after the birth that had taken her daughter and grandchild. The only thing she said during her testimony was, "May God have mercy on your souls, for I cannot." Drs. Sullivan and Porter provided the medical proof. The audience's yells and gasps regularly cut through their technical explanations of the laboratory's contents and the different preserved specimens. The testimony was so vivid that a number of witnesses were forced to leave the courtroom. The judge thought about dismissing the case, but ultimately concluded that the matter's public interest exceeded any sensibility issues. The most damning testimony was provided by Dr. Porter, who categorically claimed that, considering the specimen's condition of preservation and the absence of any acceptable source for such materials in the area, they could only have been obtained by desecration of graves. Regardless of the alleged scientific goals, he also testified that the constructed form discovered on the lab table was proof of research conducted much outside the parameters of recognized medical practice. Each witness was cross-examined by the Blackwoods with clinical precision, avoiding emotive appeals and concentrating on technical details. Citing particular publications and studies that they said backed their experimental approach, they asked Dr. Porter a number of questions concerning developments in European medical research. They disputed the family's identifications of personal belongings discovered in the lab, arguing that their perceptions had been distorted by grief. They remained, throughout, the cold, almost cruel manner that had marked their relations since imprisonment. Unexpectedly, on the second day of the hearing, 2-year-old Thomas Collins, the son of a farmer whose land bordered the Blackwood house, testified. According to the boy's testimony, he had seen the brothers coming back from their nighttime strolls on multiple times. He had once followed them from a distance, out of curiosity. He had witnessed them carrying a canvas bag and tools as they climbed over the back wall and entered the cemetery. He had fled home because he was too scared to keep watching. When asked why he hadn't reported this sooner, the boy said that he had informed his father, who had written it off as childish imagination. His father didn't think twice about the story until the arrest became public, at which point he brought it to Constable Merritt's notice. In their refusal to cross-examine the youngster, the brothers only stated that youthful fancy should not be entered into the legal record as fact. The cell where the Blackwoods were being detained during the trial was vacant when the courthouse custodian arrived in the morning on December 18, the third day of hearings. The lock had not been pried. In fact, it was still firmly locked. The strong wood door, with its iron latch and a little barred window that was too small for a man to fit through, were the sole openings in the cell. One of the case's unsolved mysteries is how the brothers got away. Immediately, a manhunt was planned. Telegrams were issued to police departments and railroad stations across the Northeast, and riders were deployed to nearby towns. They put surveillance on the Blackwood house in case they came back. The court ordered the confiscation and eventual destruction of their laboratory supplies, but not before Dr. Porter finished his paperwork and examination. Additional notebooks and correspondence were found in secret compartments in the cellar walls when the Blackwood house was searched after their escape. These materials, which were briefly reviewed before being admitted into evidence, indicated ties to European medical researchers and potential funding from unidentified sources who were interested in their study. The most unsettling were a number of drawings depicting increasingly intricate arrangements of human components, along with notes about chemical preservation and electrical stimulation. They never located the Blackwoods. In the months that followed, sightings were reported from as far away as Chicago and New Orleans, but none could be verified. Until 1915, when it was eventually archived as unsolved, the case was still formally open. The town of Oakridge was permanently damaged by the fallout from the Blackwood affair. With the entire community present, Reverend Hawthorne conducted a sad ceremony to reconsecrate the desecrated graves. The names of individuals whose rest had been disturbed were inscribed on a plaque that was placed in Elmwood Cemetery. For years, the Blackwood house remained vacant, because no one would buy a home connected to such gloomy incidents. The land remained undeveloped until it was included in a community park decades after it was eventually dismantled in 1902. After learning of the desecration, Jonathan Holloway never fully recovered from the anguish of losing both his wife and kid. In the spring of 1890, he reportedly departed Oakridge and headed west after selling his timber interests. In 1892, letters from San Francisco said he had made his home there, but was not doing well. After 1895, there are no more records of him. Until his retirement in 1910, Constable Merritt remained a member of Oakridge's police force. According to his writings, he was constantly looking for information regarding the whereabouts of the Blackwoods, keeping in touch with police agencies nationwide, and gathering accounts of similar egregious desecrations or strange medical experiments. Later, his granddaughter reported that he kept case-related materials in a locked chest, which he would occasionally check while making notes and cross-referencing them. If it weren't for a number of findings uncovered in 1953 while renovating a historic Boston building that had once housed the New England Medical Institute, a private scientific institute that existed from 1870 to 1920, the narrative may have ended there and faded into local mythology. Photographs, letters, and journals belonging to the Blackwood Twins were among the things discovered in a sealed storage chamber. Construction workers found the materials and, seeing their possible historical value, gave them to the Boston Historical Society, instead of throwing them away. The materials were cataloged by archivist Margaret Donnelly, who noted their association with the notorious Oakridge case. About 200 pages of handwritten notes, 63 letters and telegrams, 17 photographic plates, and numerous diagrams and sketches with the names Edmund or Edgar Blackwood, or both, were included in her first report. The information presented showed a history that was far more broad and unsettling than what was implied by the occurrences in Oakridge. Before coming to upstate New York, the brothers reportedly carried out similar studies in at least 3 other places. They had ties to European medical researchers, especially in Vienna and Edinburgh, where they had conducted extreme human experimentation in the name of scientific progress. Subject #7 showed momentary responsiveness to electrical stimulation. Extremities exhibited involuntary movement for approximately 12 seconds. Heart muscle contracted twice when directly stimulated. A journal entry from March 1887 mentioned experiments carried out in a remote region of Pennsylvania. Progress, though incremental, confirms our fundamental hypothesis regarding reanimation potential. Another entry from November 1888, shortly after they arrived in Oakridge. The isolation here is ideal for our purposes. The local physician is competent enough in a rudimentary way, but lacks both curiosity and suspicion. The townspeople are ignorant, but not hostile. The cemetery is poorly secured and infrequently monitored. We anticipate productive work in the coming months. The most important was a correspondence between the Blackwoods and a physician who was only known as S., who seemed to be providing financial support for their work. In a July 1889 letter, S. stated, "Your progress is remarkable. The integration of disparate tissues without rejection suggests we are on the correct path. Continue with specimens of the youngest possible age. Their regenerative capacity is strongest before development has advanced." In August 1889, the brothers replied with their objectives. "We have identified suitable sources in the local population. The recent influenza outbreak has provided several promising specimens, though we must proceed with caution. The electrical apparatus you sent functions admirably. The results with the partial assemblage exceed our previous achievements. We require additional chemical compounds for preservation, however. The formula enclosed has shown optimal results. Even the Blackwoods' own notes were cold and professional. Without emotion or ethical thought, they documented measurements, observations, and experimental procedures. According to a manifesto discovered among their papers, their ultimate objective was nothing less than the production of life from death, the building of a new entity from the parts of the deceased, infused with a live spark by the use of chemical and electrical stimulation. A notebook that was especially unsettling included what seemed to be a methodical assessment of various human subjects according to age, health, and what the brothers called vital capacity. Infants and young children were rated highest, with notes about tissue elasticity, neuroplasticity, and regenerative potential. Perhaps the most unsettling feature of the Blackwood papers, according to academics, was the clinical coldness of these evaluations, which showed little regard for the humanity of its patients. They meticulously recorded both successful and unsuccessful methods. Various stages of their experiments were documented by photographs discovered among the papers. The Massachusetts Attorney General ordered that the majority be sealed because they were too upsetting to be made public. Anatomical specimens, laboratory sets, and close-ups of surgical procedures were among those made available to researchers. One medical historian characterized them as decades ahead of their time in technique, if horrifically misapplied. The Blackwoods' work's financial support was disclosed in a ledger book. Regular donations came from the enigmatic S, and other people who could only be identified by their initials occasionally contributed. They had more than enough money to support their study and keep up their way of life without resorting to traditional medical procedures. Although letters indicated ties to affluent people interested in prolonging human life or overcoming natural restrictions, the source of these funding was still unknown. In his 1965 monograph, The Blackwood Affair, Medical Experimentation and Moral Boundaries in 19th Century America, historian Robert Chambers examined the brothers' works in light of recent advances in science. According to Chambers, the Blackwoods were an extreme example of a larger trend in medical research at the time, a readiness to cross moral lines in the name of scientific progress, frequently supported by claims of potential advantages for humanity in the future. The Blackwoods were not anomalies, said Chambers, but rather the logical endpoint of a philosophical trajectory that separated scientific progress from moral constraint. Their work echoes the unethical experimentation conducted on vulnerable populations throughout medical history, though with a uniquely macabre focus on reanimation rather than treatment or prevention of disease. The Blackwoods' notes made frequent references to Luigi Galvani, the 18th century physicist, whose experiments with electrical stimulation of dead animal tissue had given rise to the term galvanism. Chambers also noted the brothers' apparent obsession with Galvani's work, as well as Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, which they appeared to regard as a vision of scientific possibility rather than a warning. Dr. Eleanor Winters, a medical historian who specializes in 19th century surgical techniques, studied the Blackwood materials in 1968 while working on a cataloging assignment at the Boston Medical Archives. According to her analysis, which was published in the Journal of Medical History 43 No. 2 1968, the twins had created methods that were decades ahead of numerous significant developments in transplant surgery. While their methods were unquestionably unethical and their philosophy deeply disturbing, said Dr. Winters, the Blackwoods appear to have solved certain problems of tissue preservation and vascular reconnection that would not be successfully addressed by mainstream medicine until the 1940 seconds. Their work represents a dark chapter in medical history. Brilliant minds, untethered from moral constraints, pursuing knowledge regardless of human cost. In particular, Dr. Winters highlighted advancements in the brothers' strategy for avoiding tissue rejection, a major obstacle in transplant treatment. Prior to the current understanding of immunosuppression, they employed pharmacologic compounds made from specific plant extracts to lessen rejection responses amongst tissues from various donors. In a similar vein, their methods for maintaining functional neural tissue outside the body marked important breakthroughs that orthodox medicine would not make for many years. The tragedy, said Dr. Winters, is that these genuine scientific insights came at such an unconscionable moral cost. Had the Blackwoods directed their obvious brilliance toward ethical research, they might have been celebrated pioneers rather than reviled monsters. Their story serves as a powerful reminder that scientific advancement, without ethical constraint, leads not to progress, but to a perversion of the very values that should guide medical research. When an elderly man named Thomas Collins approached the Oakridge Historical Society in 1959, the last piece of the Blackwood story came to light. In 1889, Collins was 12 years old and lived on a farm next to the Blackwood estate. Collins reported seeing weird lights in the sky above the abandoned Blackwood house the night the twins vanished from the jail cell. He had skulked across the fields to look inside it, furious. Collins said, "I saw them clear as day," in an interview that was recorded. Both brothers, standing in the garden behind their house, looking up at the lights, they had a bundle between them, something wrapped in canvas. The lights got brighter, so bright I had to shield my eyes. When I could see again, they were gone. Just gone, not running away, not hiding. Vanished, like they had been taken up into the light. Collins's account goes on to say, "I was too scared to tell anyone then. Who'd believe a boy saying he saw men disappear into lights in the sky? But I know what I saw. I've carried it all these years." The constable and his men, they searched that house top to bottom the next day. They found nothing, no secret passages, no hidden rooms, nothing to explain how the brothers could have returned there after escaping the jail. But I saw them there, plain as I see you now. In response to questions about the lights, Collins said they were not like any lamps or lanterns I'd ever seen, brighter, with a bluish tinge. They moved in ways that didn't seem natural, hovering and then darting about. The air felt strange, too charged, like before a lightning storm, making the hair on my arms stand up. Collins was afraid of being laughed at, so he had never told this story before. He refused to speculate about what he had seen, even in his 80 seconds, saying only, "I know what I saw. Make of it what you will." The interviewer, local historian Martha Jenkins, wrote in her accompanying report that, despite the passing of 70 years, Collins seemed completely coherent and lucid in his memory. She also saw that he appeared relieved to finally talk about the incident, as though he were letting go of a long-held secret. Although it would not explain the disappearance of the Blackwoods, meteorological records for the area on the night of the 18th of December 1889 show unusual atmospheric conditions, what contemporaries called northern lights, visible much farther south than typical. This natural phenomenon could explain Collins's observations. Over the years, the Blackwood case has given rise to a number of theories. According to others, the brothers' Confederates assisted them in eluding justice. Others cite the peculiar circumstances surrounding their disappearance as proof of something that defies easy explanation. The importance of their work, which sits at the uneasy nexus of moral atrocity and dazzling ingenuity, is still up for debate among historians and medical ethicists. Frederick Benson, a crime historian, suggested in 1960 that the Blackwoods were involved in a network of grave thieves who provided cadavers to medical schools, a practice that was prevalent in the 19th century even though it was prohibited. According to Benson, this network could have made their escape easier by giving them new identities and jobs in a far-off medical facility where their odd research could go on unhindered. The precision of their anatomical work and their evident surgical skill, stated Benson, would have made them valuable assets to certain institutions not overly concerned with the ethical implications of their methods. It is entirely possible that they continued their research under different names, perhaps in South America or Eastern Europe, where oversight was minimal and moral questions easily suppressed with sufficient financial incentive. Unexpected sources gave rise to other theories. At the height of the public's fascination with unidentified flying objects, in 1967, Collins's story of the Blackwoods' disappearance appeared in the sensationalist magazine Visitors from Beyond, a history of extraterrestrial interaction. The article implied that the brothers had been chosen by non-human intelligences who were intrigued by their experimental approach to human physiology. Although scholarly historians rejected such views, popular culture found resonance with them. The distinction between historical fact and fanciful speculation became even more hazy in the public consciousness when a fictionalized version of the Blackwood case was featured in a 1969 episode of a popular television series about paranormal occurrences. Criminologist Richard Taylor provided a more grounded interpretation in 1966 when he presented a thorough investigation of the physical evidence related to the Blackwoods escape. Given that William Harris, the night watchman on duty, had abruptly departed Oakridge 2 weeks after the incident and moved to Chicago without telling friends or family why, Taylor came to the conclusion that the most likely explanation was bribery or coercion of the jail staff. The historical record shows that Harris, previously of modest means, purchased a substantial property in Chicago in early 1890, Taylor said. The source of these funds was never established. While circumstantial, this evidence strongly suggests complicity in the Blackwoods escape, whether motivated by financial gain or other forms of leverage. After years of being abandoned, Oakridge's Blackwood house was finally demolished in 1902. The land remained undeveloped even after the building was removed, and no one would buy the property. Although it is now a part of Oakridge Community Park, many elderly locals still call that area Blackwood Ground, and many people report feeling uneasy when they stroll there for some reason. According to local mythology, there are unusual noises coming from the ground where the house used to be: glass tinkling, mechanical clicking, and sometimes what sounds like muffled wailing coming from a distance. Though few give a detailed explanation, parents caution their kids not to play in that area after dark. Such stories are dismissed by the rational as the inevitable tendency of communities to mythologize tragic or unsettling occurrences. But the legend's enduring influence over the generations points to a deeper influence on Oakridge's collective consciousness. In a ceremony that the entire community attended, the graves that had been desecrated in 1889 were reinterred. To honor those whose sleep had been disrupted, a unique monument was placed in Elmwood Cemetery. Even today, visitors to the cemetery frequently lay flowers at the memorial, which is a plain granite obelisk bearing the phrase, "May they now find the peace that was once denied them." A particular prayer for the victims of the desecrations of the Blackwoods is part of the annual Decoration Day celebration. In order to guarantee that they are not only remembered as the victims of a horrific historical event, but also as people whose dignity was infringed and subsequently restored through communal commemoration, their names are read aloud. A fire that destroyed many of the primary documents pertaining to the Blackwood scandal in 1962 may have been the most disturbing conclusion to the case. Although the source of the fire was never identified, it was found to have originated in the records room. The testimony of witnesses at the canceled trial, the comprehensive inventory of the objects discovered in the Blackwood cellar, and Constable Merritt's official reports were among the destroyed records. Many found the fire's timing strange because it happened just months after the Boston discovery rekindled attention in the case. Others proposed intentional arson, possibly committed by the progeny of the enigmatic S, or by others associated with the Blackwoods' activities who wanted to destroy any records. A more mundane cause offered by others was the courthouse's deteriorating electrical system. Regardless of the reason, the outcome was to further obscure the Blackwood case by eliminating original sources that could have provided clarification on specific parts of the story. This was merely a coincidence, according to some. Others question whether someone or something wanted to conceal some aspects of the Blackwood experiments from contemporary view, pointing to the timing just months after the case's resurgence in the wake of the Boston findings. While investigating family history in 1965, a descendant of Constable Merritt found contact that continued well into the early 1900s between Merritt and police departments in other large cities. According to these letters, Merritt had never given up on finding the Blackwoods, pursuing leads, and looking into instances similar to his own across the nation. "I am still convinced that the Blackwood brothers continue their abhorrent work," Merritt wrote in a 1903 letter to the Chicago Police Department, "and the case recently reported in your jurisdiction, the discovery of preserved human remains in an abandoned warehouse, bears their distinctive characteristics: surgical precision, methodical organization, and a focus on pediatric specimens. I urge you to examine any documentation or equipment found at the scene for connections to their known methodologies." Merritt's papers did not contain a response to this letter, and there is no mention of any investigation that was prompted by his correspondence. It's unclear if this is the result of intentional concealment, bureaucratic oversight, or just the low attention given to the issues of a small-town constable from a different state. After Edmund and Edgar Blackwood vanished from Oakridge, what happened to them? What was their research really about? Who was the enigmatic S that provided funding for their gruesome endeavors? These are still open questions. Certain knowledge, like certain tombs, is best left undisturbed, so maybe that is preferable. The final destiny of the patchwork construct that so shocked Dr. Porter and Constable Merritt, the assembled shape discovered on the laboratory table, remains unknown. According to official documents, everything from the Blackwood cellar was destroyed when the investigation was over, but there were long-standing suspicions that certain specimens were kept for scientific research and taken to hospitals in Boston or New York. A disturbing note from January 1890 has been found among Dr. Porter's personal correspondence, which was found among his papers after his death in 1920. The primary specimen from the Blackwood case has been transferred to secure storage at the request of the State Medical Board. I have registered my objection to this decision. Such material should be cremated and the ashes interred with appropriate ceremony. To preserve it, even for scientific documentation, seems to me a perpetuation of the original violation. There is no record in the State Medical Board archives attesting to this transfer, and historians have not been able to find any facility acknowledging receipt of materials from the Blackwood case. Because of this disparity, some have questioned whether the specimen was actually destroyed as stated in the official record, or if it was kept secret in an institutional archive or private collection. An Albany Medical College janitor found a sealed compartment in the pathology building's sub-basement in 1964. There was a solitary glass tank inside that held what looked to be a preserved human figure with infantile proportions but inexplicable anatomical abnormalities. The room was promptly secured by college officials, who also barred all but a few researchers from entering. The materials were taken to a secret location within a week, and employees were told not to discuss what they had discovered. Miguel Ramirez, the janitor, never discussed the discovery in public and respected the secrecy agreement he had signed, but he subsequently told his family what he had witnessed. After his grandfather's passing in 1968, Carlos Ramirez, his grandson, told researchers about it. My grandfather said it was like nothing he had ever seen before. It looked like a child, but wrong somehow. The proportions weren't right, and there were metal parts embedded in the chest and head. The skin was pale, almost translucent, preserved in some kind of liquid. But what disturbed him most was the expression on its face. He said it looked peaceful, almost like it was sleeping, waiting to wake up. He had nightmares about it for years afterward. Was this a brainchild of the Blackwoods, hidden away for 3/4 of a century? Did it indicate if their experiments were successful or unsuccessful? Even more concerning is the question of whether it is still intact, conserved, or waiting for the completion of work that was started so long ago, as some rumors imply. If there are answers, they are still concealed in lost records, sealed archives, and the recollections of long-dead people. A historical warning that certain boundaries exist for a reason and that some secrets are better left buried. The tale of the Blackwood Twins and their dreadful labor in that Oakridge cellar serves as a reminder of the darkness that can lurk behind intellectual curiosity when separated from moral restraint. Before being classed and restricted, Edmund Blackwood's journal was briefly made available to researchers at the Boston Medical Archives in 1967. Those who examined it reported a final entry dated December 17th, the day before the brothers went missing, titled, "We stand at the precipice of the greatest advancement in human history. Our work here has provided the foundation, but we recognize now that completion requires resources beyond what this primitive setting can provide. Zaz arranged for our continuation elsewhere. The subject will accompany us, too valuable to abandon, too promising to destroy. When next we document our progress, it will be from a position of security and support that will ensure the fulfillment of our vision. Death itself trembles before us." This mysterious remark has increased conjecture over the brothers' whereabouts. Did they really flee and carry on their experiments at some covert facility that the enigmatic S had funded? Did they get the desired reanimation? Perhaps most unsettling are the sporadic reports, over the decades since their disappearance, of similar cases worldwide, findings of temporary labs with preserved human remains, meticulously arranged. Reports of grave robberies that target recent infant and child burials, sightings of identical twins who match the Blackwoods description, always in isolated places, always connected to strange disappearances or unexplained phenomena. Or did their efforts come to an end when they vanished from Oakridge, their goals unmet? A tenuous thread through the 20th century, these accounts were gathered by a variety of researchers and amateur historians who were interested in the case. Many of them can be ascribed to copycat actions motivated by knowledge of the original case, and none have been conclusively connected to the Blackwoods. However, the pattern continues, indicating either an unlikely longevity or, more likely, that others who share their aberrant vision will carry on their task. Beyond historical interest, the Blackwood case has left a lasting legacy. It brings up important issues regarding the limits of medical research, the morality of scientific progress, and the possible repercussions of seeking knowledge without regard for morality. When discussing permission, dignity, and the handling of human remains, contemporary medical ethicists bring up the case. Public outrage over cases such as the Blackwoods led to the creation of institutional review boards and ethical standards for research involving human participants. The Blackwood incident cast a shadow over Oakridge's people for many decades. The community had a reputation for strange happenings, including more than normal kid sleepwalking, electrical outages that affected household appliances, and mysterious noises coming from the woods around the old Blackwood property. Although the majority of these events are explained by suggestion and the strength of collective memory, they nevertheless demonstrate the case's significant psychological impact on the community. A descendant of Catherine Holloway paid homage at the family burial at Oakridge in 1969. Catherine's husband's grandson, Jonathan Holloway, Jr., had grown up hearing bits and pieces of the family tragedy, but wanted a fuller picture. The town greeted him with solemn acknowledgement of his family's ties to their common past, and his visit took place on the 80th anniversary of the Blackwood discoveries. Holloway visited the location of the former Blackwood house while he was there. In a local newspaper interview, he recalled a profound feeling. Standing there, I felt a connection, not just to my family's past, but to something larger, a confrontation between light and darkness that continues to resonate. The Blackwoods represent a kind of intellectual arrogance that still threatens us today. The belief that knowledge justifies any means used to obtain it, that human dignity can be sacrificed on the altar of progress. The Blackwood Twins' tale, which darkly reflects humanity's twin ability for moral transgression and dazzling creativity, never ceases to both enchant and upset. It serves as a reminder that the most deadly monsters are not supernatural beings, but rather people who have broken the moral rules that oblige us to treat each other with decency and respect. Perhaps the tangible remains of their work-preserved specimens, meticulous notes, the assembled form that symbolized their final goal, remain in some shuttered storehouse or forgotten archive. Perhaps others who share their aim of overcoming the barrier between life and death at any cost are carrying on their studies. They may have disappeared from Oakridge that night in December 1889, taking their awful knowledge with them, or, perhaps, as many believe, their job came to an end. It's possible that certain secrets, doors, and borders are best left unexplored, unopened, and unmarked. Elmwood Cemetery's graves are still unaltered. Standing as a silent sentinel and a reminder of wounds healed but not forgotten is the memorial to the Blackwoods victims. Additionally, the story endures in Oakridge's collective memory as a warning tale that has been passed down through the generations, guaranteeing that Blackwood's names and the horrific events of that long-ago winter will never be completely forgotten or relegated to history. One question stands out above all others for those who study the case. Given our advanced knowledge of genetics, neurology, and cellular regeneration, what might be possible now, more than a century later? If the Blackwoods were so close to their goal in 1889, with the limited knowledge and technology of their time, few people feel comfortable posing this topic out loud, although it lingers on the periphery of some research institutions, trials, and goals. Maybe there's a reason why certain borders exist. It's best to leave some tombs alone.